The Route of Ampoi by Clark Ashton Smith. A circus had arrived in Auburn. The siding at the station was crowded with long lines of cars from which issued a medley of exotic howls, growls, snarls, and trumpetings. Elephants and zebras and dromedaries were led along the main streets, and many of the freaks and performers wandered about the town. Two bearded ladies passed with the graceful air and walk of women of fashion. Then came a whole troop of midgets, trudging along with the look of mournful, sophisticated children. And then I saw the giant, who was slightly more than 8 feet tall and magnificently built, with no sign of the disproportion which often attends giantism. He was merely a fine physical specimen of the ordinary man, somewhat more than life-size. And even at first glance, there was something about his features and his gait which suggested a seaman. I am a doctor, and the man provoked my medical curiosity. His abnormal bulk and height, without trace of acromegaly, was something I had never happened to meet before. He must have felt my interest, for he returned my gaze with a speculative eye, and then, lurching in sailor-like fashion, he came over to me. "I say, sir, could a chap buy a drink in this here town?" he queried cautiously. I made a quick decision. "Come with me," I replied. "I'm an allopath, and I can tell without asking that you're a sick man." We were only a block from my office. I steered the giant up the stairs and into my private sanctum. He almost filled the place, even when he sat down at my urging. I brought out a bottle of rye and poured a liberal glassful for him. He downed it with manifest appreciation. He had worn an air of mild depression when I first met him. Now he began to brighten. "You wouldn't think, to look at me, that I wasn't always a bloomin' giant," he soliloquized. "Have another drink," I suggested. After the second glass, he resumed a little mournfully. "No, sir, Jim Knox wasn't always a damn circus freak." Then, with little urging on my part, he told me his story. Knox, an adventurous cockney, had followed half the seas of the world as a common sailor and boatswain in his younger years. He had visited many strange places, had known many bizarre experiences. Before he had reached the age of 30, his restless and daring disposition led him to undertake an incredibly fantastic quest. The events preceding this quest were somewhat unusual in themselves. Shipwrecked by a wild typhoon in the Banda Sea, and apparently the one survivor, Knox had drifted for 2 days on a hatch torn from the battered and sinking vessel. Then, rescued by a native fishing proa, he had been carried to Sulawesi. The Rajah of Sulawesi, an old and monkey-like Malay, was very nice to Knox. The Rajah was a teller of voluminous tales, and the boatswain was a patient listener. On this basis of congeniality, Knox became an honored guest for a month or more at the Rajah's palace. Here, among other wonders retailed by his host, he heard for the first time the rumor of a most remarkable Papuan tribe. This unique tribe dwelt on a nigh inaccessible plateau of the Arfak Mountains. The women were 9 feet tall and white as milk, but the men, strangely, were of normal stature and darker hue. They were friendly to the rare travelers who reached their domains, and they would trade for glass beads and mirrors the pigeons' blood rubies in which their mountain slopes abounded. As proof of the latter statement, the Rajah showed Knox a large, flawless, uncut ruby, which he claimed had come from this region. Knox was hardly inclined to credit the item about the giant women, but the rubies sounded far less improbable. It was characteristic of him that, with little thought of danger, difficulty, or the sheer absurdity of such a venture, he made up his mind at once to visit the Arfak Mountains. Bidding farewell to his host, who mourned the loss of a good listener, he continued his odyssey. By means that he failed to specify in his history, Knox procured 2 sacksfuls of mirrors and glass beads, and managed to reach the coast of northwest New Guinea. At Andai, in Iraq, he hired a guide who purported to know the whereabouts of the giant Amazons, and struck boldly inland toward the mountains. The guide, who was half Malay and half Papuan, bore one of the sacks of baubles on his shoulders, and Knox carried the other. He fondly hoped to return with 2 sacks full of smoldering dark red rubies. It was a little-known land. Some of the peoples were reputed to be headhunters and cannibals, but Knox found them friendly enough. But somehow, as they went on, the guide began to exhibit a growing haziness in his geography, and when they reached the middle slopes of the Arfak Range, Knox realized that the guide knew little more than himself regarding the location of the fabulous ruby-strewn plateau. They went on through the steepening forest. Before them, above trees that were still tall and semi-tropical, arose the granite scarps and crags of a high mountain wall, behind which the afternoon sun had disappeared. In the early twilight, they camped at the foot of a seemingly insuperable cliff. Knox awoke in a blazing yellow dawn to discover that his guide had departed, taking one of the sacks of trinkets, which, from a savage viewpoint, would constitute enough capital to set the fellow up in business for life. Knox shrugged his shoulders and swore a little. The guide wasn't much of a loss, but he didn't like having his jewel-purchasing power diminished by half. He looked at the cliffs above. Tier on tier, they towered away in the glow of dawn, with tops scarce distinguishable from the clouds above them. Somehow, the more he looked, the surer he became that they were the cliffs which guarded the hidden plateau. With their silence and inaccessible solitude, their air of eternal reserve and remoteness, they couldn't be anything else but the ramparts of a realm of Titan women and pigeons' blood rubies. He shouldered his pack and followed the granite wall in search of a likely starting place for the climb he had determined to attempt. The upright rock was smooth as a metal sheet and didn't offer a toe-hold for a spider monkey. But at last he came to a deep chasm which formed the bed of a summer-dried cataract. He began to ascend the chasm, which was no mean feat in itself, for the stream bed was a series of high shelves like a giant stairway. Half the time he dangled by his fingers without a toe-hold, or stretched on tiptoe and felt precariously for a finger grip. The climb was a ticklish business, with death on the pointed rocks below as the penalty for the least miscalculation. He dared not look back on the way he had climbed in that giddy chasm. Toward noon, he saw above him the menacing overhang of a huge crag, where the straightening gully ceased in a black-mouthed cavern. He scrambled up the final shelf into the cave, hoping that it led, as was likely, to an upper entrance made by the mountain torrent. By the light of struck matches, he scaled a slippery incline. The cave soon narrowed, and Knox could brace himself between the walls, as if in a chimney's interior. After long upward groping, he discerned a tiny glimmering ahead, like a pinprick in the solid gloom. Knox, nearly worn out with his efforts, was immensely heartened. But again the cave narrowed, till he could squeeze no farther with the pack on his back. He slid back a little distance and removed the sack, which he then proceeded to push before him up a declivity of 45 degrees. In those days, Knox was of average height and somewhat slender, but even so he could barely wriggle through the last 10 feet of the cavern. He gave the sack a final heave and landed it on the surface without. Then he squirmed through the opening and fell exhausted in the sunlight. He lay almost at the fountainhead of the dried stream, in a saucer-like hollow at the foot of a gentle slope of granite, beyond whose ridge the clouds were white and near. Knox congratulated himself on his gift as an alpine climber. He felt no doubt whatever that he had reached the threshold of the hidden realm of rubies and giant women. Suddenly, as he lay there, Several men appeared against the clouds on the ridge above. Striding like mountaineers, they came toward him with excited jabberings and gestures of amazement, and he rose and stood awaiting them. Knox must have been a singular spectacle. His clothing and face were bestreaked with dirt, and with the stains of party-colored ores acquired in his passage through the cavern. The approaching men seemed to regard him with a sort of awe. They were dressed in short reddish-purple tunics, and wore leather sandals. They did not belong to any of the lowland types. Their skin was a light sienna, and their features were good even according to European standards. All were armed with long javelins, but seemed friendly. Wide-eyed, and apparently somewhat timorous, they addressed Knox in a language which bore no likeness to any Melanesian tongue he had ever heard. He replied in all the languages of which he had the least smattering, but plainly they could not understand him. Then he untied his sack, took out a double handful of beads, and tried to convey by pantomime the information that he was a trader from remote lands. The men nodded their heads. Beckoning him to follow them, they returned toward the cloud-rimmed ridge. Knox trudged along behind them, feeling quite sure that he had found the people of the Rajah's tale. Topping the ridge, he saw the perspectives of a long plateau, full of woods, streams, and cultivated fields. In the mild and slanting sunlight, he and his guides descended a path among flowering willow herbs and rhododendrons to the plateau. There it soon became a well-trodden road, running through forests of damar and fields of wheat. Houses of rough-hewn stone with thatched roofs, evincing a higher civilization than the huts of the Papuan seaboard, began to appear at intervals. Men, garbed in the same style as Knox's guides, were working in the fields. Then Knox perceived several women, standing together in an idle group. Now he was compelled to believe the whole story about the hidden people, for these women were 8 feet or more in height, and had the proportions of shapely goddesses. Their complexion was not of a milky fairness, as in the Rajah's tale, but was tawny and cream-like, and many shades lighter than that of the men. Knox felt a jubilant excitement as they turned their calm gaze upon him, and watched him with the air of majestic statues. He had found the legendary realm, and he peered among the pebbles and grasses of the wayside, half expecting to see them intersown with rubies. None was in evidence, however. A town appeared, circling a sapphire lake with one-storied but well-built houses laid out in regular streets. Many people were strolling or standing about, and all the women were tawny giantesses, and all the men were of average stature with umber or sienna complexions. A crowd gathered about Knox, and his guides were questioned in a quite peremptory manner by some of the Titan females, who eyed the boatswain with embarrassing intentions. He divined at once the respect and obeisance paid these women by the men, and inferred the superior position which they held. They all wore the tranquil and assured look of empresses. Knox was led to a building near the lake. It was larger and more pretentious than the others. The roomy interior was arrased with roughly pictured fabrics and furnished with chairs and couches of ebony. The general effect was rudely sybaritic and palatial, and much enhanced by the unusual height of the ceilings. In a sort of audience room, a woman sat enthroned on a broad dais. Several others stood about her like a bodyguard. She wore no crown, no jewels, and her dress differed in no wise from the short kilts of the other women. But Knox knew that he had entered the presence of a queen. The woman was fairer than the rest, with long rippling chestnut hair and fine oval features. The gaze that she turned upon Knox was filled with a feminine mingling of mildness and severity. The boatswain assumed his most gallant manner, which must have been a little nullified by his dirt-smeared face and apparel. He bowed before the giantess, and she addressed him with a few soft words in which he sensed a courteous welcome. Then he opened his pack and selected a mirror and a string of blue beads, which he offered to the queen. She accepted the gifts gravely, showing neither pleasure nor surprise. After dismissing the men who had brought Knox to her presence, the queen turned and spoke to her female attendants. They came forward and gave Knox to understand that he must accompany them. They led him to an open court containing a huge bath fed by the waters of the Blue Lake. Here, in spite of his protests and strugglings, they undressed him as if he had been a little boy. Then they plunged him into the water and scrubbed him thoroughly with scrapers of stiff vegetable fiber. One of them brought him a brown tunic and a pair of sandals in lieu of his former raiment. Though somewhat discomforted and abashed by his summary treatment, Knox couldn't help feeling like a different man after his renovation. And when the women brought in a meal of taro and millet cake and roast pigeon, piled on enormous platters, he began to forgive them for his embarrassment. 2 of his fair attendants remained with him during the meal, and afterwards they gave him a lesson in their language by pointing at various objects and naming them. Knox soon acquired a knowledge of much domestic nomenclature. The queen herself appeared later and proceeded to take a hand in his instruction. Her name, he learned, was Mabusa. Knox was an apt pupil, and the day's lesson was plainly satisfactory to all concerned. Knox realized more clearly than before that the queen was a beautiful woman, but he wished that she was not quite so large and imposing. He felt so juvenile beside her. The queen, on her part, seemed to regard Knox with a far from unfavorable gravity. He saw that she was giving him a good deal of thought and consideration. Knox almost forgot the rubies of which he had come in search, and when he remembered them, he decided to wait till he had learned more of the language before broaching the subject. A room in the palace was assigned to him, and he inferred that he could remain indefinitely as Mabusa's guest. He ate at the same table with the queen and a half-dozen attendants. It seemed that he was the only man in the establishment. The chairs were all designed for giantesses, with one exception, which resembled the high chair in which a child sits at the table amongst its elders. Knox occupied this chair. Many days went by, and he learned enough of the language for all practical purposes. It was a tranquil but far from unpleasant life. He soon grew familiar with the general conditions of life in the country ruled by Mabusa, which was called Ondawar. It was quite isolated from the world without, for the mountain walls around it could be scaled only at the point which Knox had so fortuitously discovered. Few strangers had ever obtained entrance. The people were prosperous and contented, leading a pastoral existence under the benign but absolute matriarchy of Mabusa. The women governed their husbands by sheer virtue of physical superiority, but there seemed to be fully as much domestic amity as in the households of countries where the reverse dominion prevails. Knox wondered greatly about the superior stature of the women, which struck him as being a strange provision of nature. Somehow he did not venture to ask any questions, and no one volunteered to tell him the secret. He kept an eye open for rubies, and was puzzled by the paucity of the gems. A few inferior rubies, as well as small sapphires and emeralds, were worn by some of the men as earring pendants, though none of the women was addicted to such ornaments. Knox wondered if they didn't have a lot of rubies stored away somewhere. He had come there to trade for red corundum, and had carried a whole sackload of the requisite medium of barter up an impossible mountainside, so he was loath to relinquish the idea. One day he resolved to open the subject with Mabusa. For some reason, he never quite knew why, it was hard to speak of such matters to the dignified and lovely giantess. But business was business. He was groping for suitable words when he suddenly noticed that Mabusa too had something on her mind. She had grown uncommonly silent, and the way she kept looking at him was disconcerting and even embarrassing. He wondered what was the matter. Also, he began to wonder if these people were cannibalistic. Her gaze was so eager and avid. Before he could speak of the rubies and his willingness to buy them with glass beads, Mabusa startled him by coming out with a flatly phrased proposal of marriage. To say the least, Knox was unprepared, but it seemed uncivil as well as unpolitic to refuse. He had never been proposed to before by a queen or a giantess, and he thought it would be hardly the proper etiquette to decline a heart and hand of such capacity. Also, as Mabusa's husband, he would be in a most advantageous position to negotiate for rubies, and Mabusa was undeniably attractive, even though she was built on a grand scale. After a little hemming and hawing, he accepted her proposal and was literally swept off his feet as the lady gathered him to the gargantuan charms of her bosom. The wedding proved to be a very simple affair, a mere matter of verbal agreement in the presence of several female witnesses. Knox was amazed by the ease and rapidity with which he assumed the bonds of holy matrimony. He learned a lot of things from his marriage with Mabusa. He found at the wedding supper that the high chair he had been occupying at the royal table was usually reserved for the queen's consort. Later, he learned the secret of the women's size and stature. All the children, boys and girls, were of ordinary size at birth, but the girls were fed by their mothers on a certain root, which caused them to increase in height and bulk beyond the natural limits. The root was gathered on the highest mountain slopes. Its peculiar virtue was mainly due to a mode of preparation whose secret had been carefully guarded by the women and handed down from mother to daughter. Its use had been known for several generations. At one time, the men had been the ruling sex, but an accidental discovery of the root by a downtrodden wife named Ampoi had soon led to a reversal of this domination. In consequence, the memory of Ampoi was highly venerated by the females as that of a savioress. Knox also acquired much other information on matters both social and domestic, but nothing was ever said about rubies. He was forced to decide that the plenitude of these jewels in Ondawar must have been sheer fable, a purely decorative addition to the story of the giant Amazons. His marriage led to other disillusionments. As the queen's consort, he had expected to have a share in the government of Ondawar, and had looked forward to a few kingly prerogatives, but he soon found that he was merely a male adjunct of Mabusa, with no legal rights, no privileges, other than those which she, out of wifely affection, might choose to accord him. She was kind and loving, but also strong-minded, not to say bossy, and he learned that he couldn't do anything or go anywhere without first consulting her and obtaining permission. She would sometimes reprimand him, would often set him right on some point of Ondawarian etiquette and the general conduct of life, in a sweet but strict manner, and it never occurred to her that he might even wish to dispute any of her mandates. He, however, was irked more and more by this feminine tyranny. His male pride, his manly British spirit, revolted. If the lady had been of suitable size, he would, in his own phrase, have knocked her about a little. But, under the circumstances, any attempt to chasten her by main strength hardly seemed advisable. Along with all this, he grew quite fond of her in his fashion. There were many things that endeared her to him, and he felt that she would be an exemplary wife if there was only some way of curbing her deplorable tendency to domineer. Time went on, as it has a habit of doing. Mabusa seemed to be well enough satisfied with her spouse, but Knox brooded a good deal over the false position in which he felt she had placed him, and the daily injury to his manhood. He wished that there were some way of correcting matters, and of asserting his natural rights and putting Mabusa in her place. One day he remembered the route on which the women of Andawar were fed. Why couldn't he get a hold of some of it and grow big himself like Mabusa, or bigger? Then he would be able to handle her in the proper style. The more he thought about it, the more this appealed to him as the ideal solution of his marital difficulties. The main problem, however, was to obtain the root. He questioned some of the other men in a discreet way, but none of them could tell him anything about it. The women never permitted the men to accompany them when they gathered the stuff, and the process of preparing it for consumption was carried on in deep caverns. Several men had dared to steal the food in past years. 2 of them, indeed, had grown to giant stature on what they had stolen, but all had been punished by the women with lifelong exile from Andawar. All this was rather discouraging. Also, it served to increase Knox's contempt for the men of Andawar, whom he looked upon as a spineless, effeminate lot. However, he didn't give up his plan. But after much deliberation and scheming, he found himself no nearer to a solution of the problem than before. Perhaps he would have resigned himself, as better men have done, to an inevitable lifelong henpecking. But at last, in the birth of a female baby to Mabusa and himself, he found the opportunity he had been seeking. The child was like any other girl infant, and Knox was no less proud of it, no less imbued with the customary parental sentiments than other fathers have been. It did not occur to him, till the baby was old enough to be weaned and fed on the special food, that he would now have in his own home a first-rate chance to appropriate some of the food for his personal use. The simple and artless Mabusa was wholly without suspicion of such unlawful designs. Male obedience to the feministic law of the land was so thoroughly taken for granted that she even showed him the strange foodstuff and often fed the child in his presence. Nor did she conceal from him the large earthen jar in which she kept her reserve supply. The jar stood in the palace kitchen, among others filled with more ordinary staples of diet. One day, when Mabusa had gone to the country on some political errand, and the waiting women were all preoccupied with other than culinary matters, Knox stole into the kitchen and carried away a small bagful of the stuff, which he then hid in his own room. In his fear of detection, he felt more of an actual thrill than at any time since the boyhood days when he had pilfered apples from London street barrows behind the backs of the vendors. The stuff looked like a fine variety of sago, and had an aromatic smell and spicy taste. Knox ate a little of it at once, but dared not indulge himself to the extent of a full meal, for fear that the consequences would be too visible. He had watched the incredible growth of the child, which had gained the proportions of a normal 6-year-old girl in a fortnight, under the influence of the miraculous nutrient. He did not wish to have his theft discovered, and the further use of the food prevented, in the first stage of his own development toward gianthood. He felt that some sort of seclusion would be advisable till he could attain the bulk and stature which would ensure a position as master in his own household. He must somehow remove himself from all female supervision during the period of growth. This, for one so thoroughly subject to petticoat government, with all his goings and comings minutely regulated, was no mean problem. But again fortune favored Knox, for the hunting season in Andawar had now arrived, a season in which many of the men were permitted by their wives to visit the higher mountains and spend days or weeks in tracking down a certain agile species of alpine deer known as the okla. Perhaps Mabusa wondered a little at the sudden interest shown by Knox in okla hunting, and his equally sudden devotion to practice with the javelins used by the hunters. But she saw no reason for denying him permission to make the desired trip, merely stipulating that he should go in company with certain other dutiful husbands, and should be very careful of dangerous cliffs and crevasses. The company of other husbands was not exactly in accord with Knox's plan, but he knew better than to argue the point. He had contrived to make several more visits to the palace pantry, and had stolen enough of the forbidden food to turn him into a robust and wife-taming Titan. Somehow, on that trip among the mountains, in spite of the meek and law-abiding males with whom he was condemned to go, he would find chances to consume all he had stolen. He would return a conquering Anakim, a roaring and swaggering Goliath, and everyone, especially Mabusa, would stand from under. Knox hid the food, disguised as a bag of millet meal, in his private supply of provisions. He also carried some of it in his pockets, and would eat a mouthful or two whenever the other men weren't looking, and at night, when they were all sleeping quietly, he would steal to the bag and devour the aromatic stuff by the handful. The result was truly phenomenal, for Knox could watch himself swell after the first square meal. He broadened and shot up inch by inch, to the manifest bewilderment of his companions, none of whom, at first, was imaginative enough to suspect the true reason. He saw them eyeing him with a sort of speculative awe and curiosity, such as civilized people would display before a wild man from Borneo. Obviously, they regarded his growth as a kind of biological anomaly, or perhaps as part of a queer behavior that might be expected from a foreigner of doubtful antecedents. The hunters were now in the highest mountains, at the northernmost end of Andawar. Here, among stupendous riven crags and piled pinnacles, they pursued the elusive Okla, and Knox began to attain a length of limb that enabled him to leap across chasms over which the others could not follow. At last, one or two of them must have gotten suspicious. They took to watching Knox, and one night they surprised him in the act of devouring the sacred food. They tried to warn him, with a sort of holy horror in their demeanor, that he was doing a dreadful and forbidden thing, and would bring himself the direct consequences. Knox, who was beginning to feel as well as look like an actual giant, told them to mind their own business. Moreover, he went on to express his frank and uncensored opinion of the sapless, decadent, and effeminate males of Andawar. After that, the men left him alone, but murmured fearfully among themselves, and watched his every move with apprehensive glances. Knox despised them so thoroughly that he failed to attach any special significance to the furtive disappearance of two members of the party. Indeed, at the time, he hardly noticed that they had gone. After a fortnight of alpine climbing, the hunters had slain their due quota of long-horned and goat-footed Okla, and Knox had consumed his entire store of the stolen food, and had grown to proportions which, he felt sure, would enable him to subdue his domineering helpmate, and show her the proper inferiority of the female sex. It was time to return. Knox's companions would not have dreamt of exceeding the limit set by the women, who had enjoined them to come back at the end of a fortnight, and Knox was eager to demonstrate his new-won superiority of bulk and brawn. As they came down from the mountains and crossed the cultivated plain, Knox saw that the other men were lagging behind more and more, with a sort of fearfulness and shrinking timidity. He strode on before them, carrying 3 full-sized Okla slung over his shoulders, as lesser men would have carried so many rabbits. The fields and roads were deserted, and none of the Titan women was in sight anywhere. Knox wondered a little about this, but feeling himself so much the master of the general situation, he did not overexert his mind in curious conjectures. However, as they approached the town, the desolation and silence became a trifle ominous. Knox's fellow hunters were obviously stricken with dire and growing terror, but Knox did not feel that he should lower his dignity by even asking the reason. They entered the streets, which were also strangely quiet. There was no evidence of life other than the pale and frightened faces of a few men that appeared from windows and furtively opened doors. At last they came in sight of the palace. Now the mystery was explained, for apparently all the women of Andawar had gathered in the square before the building. They were drawn up in a massive and appallingly solid formation, like an army of giant Amazons, and their utter stillness was more dreadful than the shouting and tumult of battlefields. Knox felt an unwilling but irresistible dismay before the swelling thews of their mighty arms, the solemn heaving of gargantuan bosoms, and the awful and austere gaze with which they regarded him in unison. Suddenly he perceived that he was quite alone. The other men had faded away like shadows, as if they did not even dare to remain and watch his fate. He felt an almost undeniable impulse to flee, but his British valor prevented him from yielding to it. Pace by pace he forced himself to go on toward the embattled women. They waited for him in stony silence, immovable as caryatids. He saw Mabusa in the front rank, her serving women about her. She watched him with eyes in which he could read nothing but unutterable reproach. She did not speak, and somehow the jaunty words with which he had intended to greet her were congealed on his lips. All at once, with a massed and terrible striding movement, the women surrounded Knox. He lost sight of Mabusa in a solid wall of titanesses. Great brawny hands were grasping him, tearing the spear from his fingers and the okla from his shoulders. He struggled as became a doughty Briton, but one man, even though he had eaten the food of giantesses, could do nothing against the whole tribe of 8-foot females. Maintaining a silence more formidable than any outcry, they bore him through the town and along the road by which he had entered Andawar, and up the mountain path to the outmost ramparts of the land. There, from the beetling crag above the gully he had climbed, they lowered him with a tackle of heavy ropes to the dry torrent bed 200 feet below, and left him to find his way down the perilous mountainside and back to the outer world that would accept him henceforward only as a circus freak.